Welcome back, folks. Bob here for the final time in this series. We've talked about the spark that ignited the revolution, the shot heard round the world, the darkest days at Valley Forge, and the French alliance that won the war. Today, we're going to talk about what came after. Because here's the thing nobody tells you. Winning the war, that was the easy part. Building a nation, that nearly tore everything apart. This is the story of how America almost failed before it really began. How 13 separate states tried to work together and couldn't. How a group of men gathered in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787 and created something entirely new. How they argued and compromised and somehow produced the Constitution. And how that Constitution almost didn't get ratified because people were terrified of creating another tyranny. Let's start with something most Americans don't know. After the Revolution ended in 1783, there was no United States of America as we know it today. There were 13 independent states, loosely connected by something called the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation were basically a friendship agreement. The states would cooperate on some things, like foreign policy and defense. But each state was sovereign. Each had its own laws, its own money, its own trade policies. Congress couldn't collect taxes. It couldn't regulate commerce between states. It couldn't enforce any laws. It was designed that way on purpose. The revolutionaries had just fought a war against centralized power. They weren't about to create another powerful central government that could oppress them. Better to keep power in the states, where it was closer to the people. It sounds good in theory. In practice, it was a disaster. States were printing their own money, leading to inflation and economic chaos. They were taxing goods from other states, creating trade wars. They were refusing to pay their share for the national debt from the Revolution. Some states were negotiating their own treaties with foreign powers. Veterans of the Continental Army weren't getting paid. The government had no money and no way to get money. Soldiers who'd fought for independence were losing their farms because they couldn't pay their debts. In Massachusetts in 1786, a man named Daniel Shays, a veteran of the Revolution, led a rebellion. Farmers were losing their land to debt collectors and tax collectors. They took up arms and tried to shut down the courts. It took a private army, funded by wealthy merchants, to put down Shays' rebellion. That scared the wealthy, the merchants, the landowners. If armed rebellion could happen in Massachusetts, it could happen anywhere. The country was falling apart. Something had to change. In May 1787, delegates from 12 states gathered in Philadelphia. Rhode Island refused to send anyone. They were supposed to revise the Articles of Confederation to fix the problems. Instead, they decided to throw out the Articles entirely and start over. Think about how radical that was. These delegates had no authority to create a new government. They'd been sent to fix the old one. But men like James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and George Washington knew that fixing wasn't enough. They needed something completely new. The convention met in secret. They locked the doors and windows, even though it was a hot Philadelphia summer. They swore an oath not to discuss what was said inside. They knew that if word got out about what they were debating, the whole thing might fall apart before they finished. 55 men, representing 12 states. Some of the greatest minds in America. Benjamin Franklin, 81 years old, had to be carried to the convention in a sedan chair. George Washington, the hero of the Revolution, presiding over the debates. James Madison, 36 years old, taking detailed notes and pushing for a strong federal government. They argued for 4 months, and the arguments were fierce. The big question: how do you balance power between large states and small states? Virginia had a huge population. Delaware was tiny. If representation was based on population, Virginia would dominate. If each state got equal representation, tiny Delaware would have as much power as massive Virginia. They fought over this for weeks. The small states threatened to walk out. The large states refused to accept equal representation. The whole convention nearly collapsed. Finally, Roger Sherman of Connecticut proposed a compromise. 2 houses of Congress. In the Senate, each state gets 2 senators. Equal representation. In the House of Representatives, representation based on population. The big states get more power in the House. The small states get equal power in the Senate. It's called the Great Compromise or the Connecticut Compromise. Both sides hated it, which meant it was probably fair. But there was another issue, one that was even more divisive, one that would haunt America for the next 80 years. Slavery. The southern states had huge populations of enslaved people. If slaves were counted as part of the population, the South would have more representatives in Congress. But the South didn't consider slaves to be citizens. They didn't let them vote. They didn't give them rights. The Northern delegates said, if slaves aren't citizens, you can't count them for representation. The Southern delegates said, if we can't count them, we're walking out. The compromise they reached was ugly, morally repugnant, but probably necessary to get a constitution at all. Each enslaved person would count as 3/5 of a person for the purpose of representation and taxation. Not a full person, 3/5. They also agreed that the slave trade, bringing new slaves from Africa, would continue for at least 20 more years. Congress couldn't ban it until 1808. Some Northern delegates wanted to abolish slavery entirely. They knew it was wrong, but the Southern states made it clear. No protection for slavery, no constitution. They'd walk out and form their own country. So the founders kicked the problem down the road. They knew slavery contradicted everything they'd said about equality and rights. But they told themselves that maybe, in time, slavery would die out on its own. They were wrong. It didn't die out. It expanded. And 80 years later, it would tear the country apart in a civil war. But in 1787, they made the compromise. They got a constitution, and they moved on to other issues. What kind of executive should they have? Some wanted a committee, so no one person had too much power. Others wanted a strong single executive, a president. They compromised. A president elected for 4 years with significant powers, but those powers checked by Congress and the courts. The president could veto laws, but Congress could override the veto. The president was commander-in-chief, but Congress declared war. The president appointed judges, but the Senate confirmed them. Everything was about balance, checks and balances, making sure no one person, no one branch, no one faction could dominate. James Madison called it making ambition counteract ambition. You couldn't trust people to be virtuous. You had to design a system where ambition and self-interest would balance each other out. By September 1787, they had a document. 7 articles laying out the structure of government: legislative branch, executive branch, judicial branch, how states relate to each other, how to amend the Constitution, supremacy of federal law, how the Constitution would be ratified. 39 of the 55 delegates signed it. Some refused. They thought it gave too much power to the federal government. Others thought it didn't go far enough in protecting individual rights. Benjamin Franklin, 81 years old, gave a speech at the signing. He said he didn't agree with everything in the Constitution, but it was the best they could do. He urged everyone to sign it, even if they had doubts, because the alternative was chaos. George Washington signed first, then the other delegates, state by state. Now came the hard part: getting it ratified. The Constitution said it would go into effect when 9 out of 13 states ratified it, but they wanted all 13. They wanted unanimity, if possible. The fight over ratification was brutal. The Federalists, who supported the Constitution, versus the Anti-Federalists, who opposed it. It played out in newspapers, in pamphlets, in state conventions. The Federalists had some brilliant advocates. Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay wrote a series of essays called the Federalist Papers, explaining and defending the Constitution. They're still some of the best explanations of American government ever written. But the Anti-Federalists had legitimate concerns. Where was the protection for individual rights? Where were the guarantees of free speech, free press, religious liberty? The Constitution set up a powerful government, but what would stop that government from becoming tyrannical? The Federalists promised that if the Constitution was ratified, they'd immediately add amendments protecting individual rights. A Bill of Rights. That promise was crucial. Several states ratified the Constitution only because of that promise. Delaware ratified first, in December 1787, then Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Georgia, Connecticut. By June 1788, 9 states had ratified. The Constitution was officially adopted. But Virginia and New York hadn't ratified yet. Without those 2 large, important states, the new government wouldn't really work, and Rhode Island and North Carolina were still holding out. Virginia ratified in June 1788, but barely. The vote was 89 to 79. George Washington's support probably made the difference. New York ratified in July, even closer, 30 to 27. Hamilton's arguments in the Federalist Papers and the promise of a Bill of Rights won the day. North Carolina ratified in November 1789 after the Bill of Rights had been proposed. Rhode Island, stubborn to the end, didn't ratify until May 1790. They were basically forced to. They were surrounded by states in the new Union, and they had no choice. In April 1789, George Washington was inaugurated as the first president of the United States. He took the oath of office in New York City, which was temporarily the capital. He was 57 years old. He could have been king if he'd wanted. The army would have supported him, but he chose to be a president, elected, with limited powers, accountable to the people. That choice, more than anything else, set the pattern for American government. James Madison, now a congressman, proposed 12 amendments to the Constitution. These were the Bill of Rights. 10 of them were ratified by December 1791. Freedom of speech, press, religion, and assembly. The right to bear arms, protection against unreasonable searches and seizures, the right to trial by jury, protection against self-incrimination, no cruel and unusual punishment, rights retained by the people, powers not given to the federal government reserved to the states. These weren't gifts from the government. These were recognized as fundamental rights that the government couldn't take away. That's crucial. The Bill of Rights doesn't grant rights. It protects rights that already exist. By 1791, the American experiment was underway. A republic governed by law, with power divided among branches and between federal and state governments, with written protections for individual liberty, with no king, no aristocracy, no inherited power. It was something genuinely new in the world. Most people thought it would fail. Republics in history had always collapsed into chaos or tyranny. Why would this one be different? But it didn't fail. It's still here, over 230 years later. It's been tested. Civil war, world wars, depressions, scandals, crises of every kind. The Constitution has been amended, interpreted, debated. But it's still the framework of American government. Why did it work when so many thought it would fail? I think it's because the founders understood human nature. They knew people were ambitious, self-interested, imperfect. They didn't try to create a government that depended on people being virtuous. They created a government that would work even with flawed, selfish people. They divided power so no one could have too much. They created checks and balances so ambition would counter ambition. They wrote it all down so it couldn't be changed on a whim. They made it possible to amend the Constitution, but hard enough that you couldn't do it casually. And they built in the idea that rights come from somewhere deeper than government, that there are limits on what even a majority can do to a minority. That's the genius of the Bill of Rights. Even if 99% of the people want to take away your freedom of speech, they can't. It's protected. Was the Constitution perfect? No. The Three-Fifths Compromise was morally wrong. The failure to abolish slavery was a betrayal of the Declaration's promise that all men are created equal. Women had no political rights. Only property-owning white men could vote in most states. It took amendments to fix some of those problems. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 15th gave black men the right to vote, at least on paper. The 19th gave women the right to vote. The 26th lowered the voting age to 18. The Constitution has been amended 27 times. It's a living document in that sense. But the basic structure, the framework the founders created in 1787, is still there. And here's what I want you to understand. The birth of America didn't happen at one moment. It wasn't Lexington and Concord. It wasn't the Declaration of Independence. It wasn't Yorktown. The birth of America was a process. It started with people saying, "We have rights and we'll fight for them." It continued with people enduring suffering to win those rights. And it culminated with people sitting in a hot room in Philadelphia, arguing and compromising and creating a framework for government that could protect those rights. The Revolution was about breaking away. The Constitution was about building something new. And what they built, imperfect as it was, became a model. Other nations looked at the American experiment and started their own revolutions, their own republics. The idea that people could govern themselves, that they didn't need kings and aristocrats, that spread across the world. It started here, with farmers standing on a green in Lexington, with soldiers freezing at Valley Forge, with delegates arguing in Philadelphia, with imperfect people trying to build something better. That's the story of how America was born. Not perfect, not pure, but something genuinely new. An experiment in self-government that continues to this day. Every generation has to renew the commitment to that experiment, has to defend the rights in the Constitution, has to work to make the promise of equality more real, has to remember that self-government requires work, attention, and sacrifice. The founders gave us a framework, but it's up to us to make it work. That was true in 1787. It's true today. It'll be true for as long as America exists. I'm Bob, and that's the story of how America was born. 4 episodes, from the first sparks of rebellion to the creation of the Constitution, the whole messy, complicated, inspiring story. Thank you for listening, folks. Remember, history isn't just about the past. It's about understanding where we came from so we can decide where we're going. The American experiment continues. We're all part of it. Make it count. Good night, folks, and God bless America.